listener production.
Hey, Sasha Barbagat with you. Welcome to The Briefing. Have you ever wondered why your employer or a big company promotes its involvement with carbon offsetting, charities, pride events or anti-racism campaigns? Well, it's all part of their corporate social responsibility to balance their economic interests with those of society and the environment. But is it all just a bit bullshit?
Political change which advances social justice is hard. Corporations ain't your friend, brands ain't your friend when the going gets tough.
That chat coming up in the second half of this episode. First though, it's time for the headlines with Chris Spyrou on Thursday, November 14.
Morning, Sash. Morning, everybody. A massive moment in US politics happened while we slept. Joe Biden welcomed Donald Trump to the White House after his election win. The president and president-elect sat down in front of reporters only for a minute, with Biden telling Trump he's looking forward to a smooth transition of power before welcoming him back. This was Trump's response.
Thank you very much. And politics is tough, and it's in many cases not a very nice world, but it is a nice world today, and I appreciate very much a transition that's so smooth. It'll be as smooth as it can get, and I very much appreciate that. You're welcome.
At that point, reporters were asked to leave. Some shouted questions at the two leaders, but they did not answer.
This was a very measured and polite conversation between the pair. Obviously, we only saw a minute. We don't know what happened once those doors closed. But remember, the pair feuded in a very bitter election campaign before Kamala Harris took over. Trump often referred to the president as Sleepy Joe and accused him of corruption.
I've never seen anybody lie like this guy. We mentioned the laptop. We mentioned Russia, Ukraine. Everything he does is a lie.
While Biden slammed Trump repeatedly during their one and only debate, including with this singer.
How many billions of dollars do you owe in civil penalties for molesting a woman in public, of having sex with a porn star on the night while your wife was pregnant? I mean, what are you talking about? You have the morals of an alley cat.
Yeah, so to see them sitting down, shaking hands and being very nice to each other was so bizarre. But I think the Democrats are really taking the high road on this one. They're going, remember what you did to us 4 years ago? This is how you actually do it. Something that did not happen that was supposed to happen at this meeting was a traditional morning tea between the First Lady, who is Dr. Jill Biden, and the incoming First Lady, Melania Trump. Melania chose not to attend this meeting. And what we did see, though, was Jill giving Trump a letter for his wife. Don't know what that said. I'm sure it was very polite and said, sorry you couldn't make it. I'm sure you're just a bit under the weather. All the best with the White House. But it looks like Melania Trump is not planning to move into the White House full-time when Trump takes office. This is according to sources who have spoken to CNN. Discussions about where she will live are ongoing. So that's a little mystery that we will see in the future, whether we find out where Melania actually chooses to spend all her time. I don't blame her for not wanting to live in the White House, quite frankly. I feel like she's one of those people who was like, oh man, do I have to be First Lady? I don't want to do this.
I know, and considering where they live in Florida, I mean, why would you give it up?
Yeah, why would you leave? Also, obviously, massive news yesterday with Elon Musk officially appointed to Trump's administration. And we are going to get into all of that with a deep dive this afternoon, so make sure you check back in your feed at 3.
More news today about what the federal government intends to do about social media companies in Australia. The latest, it's all about bringing in duty of care laws that will put responsibility on platforms like Facebook, Instagram and TikTok to keep Aussies, especially kids, safe when they're online. The legislation would require platforms to shift from reacting to harm towards taking reasonable steps to prevent foreseeable harms. And this was a recommendation out of an independent review of the Online Safety Act, which was handed to the government last month, but it hasn't been publicly released just yet, Sash.
Yeah, and this is, of course, in addition to the government's plans to ban 16-year-olds from social media. Now, we have heard from Matt Canavan again. I know I wasn't very nice to him on Tuesday. Go back into the headlines if you haven't heard it. You want to have a listen. But the National Senator is essentially saying we need a Senate inquiry into this legislation because he's worried that it's being rushed through with the plan to have it introduced to Parliament in the next fortnight. Canavan thinks that banning kids from YouTube would be the same as banning them from libraries because of the educational value of some of the content on the platform. Now, the communications minister has said that YouTube Kids, which is like a safeguarded section which would have very strict controls in place about what content can go up, there's talk that that could escape the ban. So kids might still be able to use YouTube Kids, but just not any other social media platform. And Green Senator Sarah Hanson-Young also thinks that it's being rushed through. So whether a Senate inquiry does anything to stop the path of this legislation remains to be seen.
There are concerns that survivors of sexual abuse won't be able to launch legal action against the Catholic Church off the back of a High Court decision handed down yesterday. Australia's top court unanimously ruled in favour of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Ballarat, finding it could not be held liable for the sexual assaults committed by one of its priests against a 5-year-old boy in the 70s. The court ruled the priest could not be legally considered an employee and thus the church could not be found vicariously liable for the abuse. Now, Sash, vicarious liability is an even more trickier and nuanced area of law. It goes deeper into liability, but essentially the crux of it is that while an employer might not be directly responsible for the conduct of its employee, where you find that that employment relationship exists, they can be found liable. Even though they didn't conduct the conduct, even though they didn't sanction the conduct, that's where liability can be extended in this employment framework. What happened here is that the diocese successfully argued that the relationship they had with the priest was governed by the church's own rules or canon law, and the court was not prepared to extend vicarious liability to such relationships. Importantly, though, 5 of the 7 judges said that this is the role of the government to expand these laws, not the court in this particular instance.
Yeah, so very tricky legal stuff.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, the important thing to note is that this is not a blanket ruling for the Catholic Church, rather specifically this particular case in this particular diocese. But nevertheless, yesterday's decision has prompted calls for law reform. So we'll see if that happens in this space. And a round of applause, please, for 3 of Australia's often forgotten cities. I'm talking about Canberra, Darwin and Hobart. They might cop slack from us, but these capitals are getting recognition on the world stage for having the cleanest air.
Ooh.
So air pollution data has been analysed by a group called Autotrader, and they compared levels in 400 cities around the world. So then these cities were ranked based on their air quality index, and Hobart, Darwin and Canberra came 3rd, 4th and 10th respectively. Well done, guys.
Well done. And look, Sydney, where we're recording right now, ranked terribly, which is not a shock to me or you, Sash. And the lowest of any Australian city at 150. Melbourne did much better at 52, but Adelaide and the Gold Coast far outranked them at 24 and 29. Perth and Brisbane came in at 95 and 96.
We talk a lot about things like secondhand smoke and people smoking, filthy smokers, but air pollution is and can be just as nasty. And the scary thing with it is that it gets into our bloodstream and it causes inflammation. So it can affect asthma, it can impact lung cancer, respiratory infections, diabetes, stroke, heart disease. They've all been linked to air pollution. So it is important to have clean air, as much as we have a little laugh about it today. A place in Tuvalu and another one in Brazil came in 1st and 2nd. A lot of Asia Pacific countries ranked in the top 20. But let's have a look at some of the worst performers. Shanghai came last at 393. New Delhi and Kolkata, both in India, were also in the bottom 3. And in terms of some other major global cities, ones that caught my eye, LA was very, very low, 367. We had Beijing at 357. Rome was 343rd, Singapore 298, and Athens, shout out to your people, Chris, 271.
Yeah, I believe it. I mean, look, stepping out of the airport, there is a certain musk. A lot of Greek Australians talk about that musk and they say that it's nostalgic, but wow, upon reflection, it's actually
poison. But well done to Hobart, Darwin and Canberra.
Absolutely.
Good for them. They need some love, so I'm happy for them. Thanks so much for joining us for the headlines, Chris. Next up, it's your deep dive into corporate social responsibility. And today we're asking, is it all just a bit bullshit?
If you work in an office in Australia, there's a pretty good chance you've been asked to down tools for a Harmony Day presentation or join a morning tea in support of International Women's Day. Maybe you've been looped in on an email chain about your company's new partnership with a charity or its commitment to choosing greener solutions in its business model. If any of these ring a bell, then you've been witness to corporate social responsibility in action. It's something many businesses do to try and foster a sense of pride and inclusivity for not only their employees, but also the people who engage with their products or services. Essentially, it's about making a profit whilst keeping society and the environment in mind. But is it all a facade and a bit bullshit? One Australian lawyer says yes, and he wants you to think so too. Josh Bornstein is the principal lawyer and national head of employment law at Morris Blackburn Lawyers, and he joins me now. Josh, thanks for joining us on The Briefing.
Thanks for having me.
First question, nice and simple. Is corporate social responsibility bullshit?
Corporate social responsibility was bullshit. It doesn't exist anymore. It's been declared dead on arrival by one of the great champions of corporate social responsibility called Lord John Browne, who was the CEO of BP many years ago and was a champion of corporate social responsibility, but over the years began to become disenchanted with it, and in about 2015 called bullshit on it and said it's ineffective and corporations need to rethink the whole notion. Since then, corporations have tried to reinvent it in other forms. Stakeholder capitalism is one of the forms. The new corporation is another. Creative capitalism. There's been a whole range of different attempts to reimagine corporations as a force for good. But my book argues that corporations essentially don't do good, and the sooner we realise that, the better for all concerned.
And of course, that's why we've got you on the program. You're definitely the expert in the field. I guess I want to step it back a little bit. What was it about Lord John Browne's perception that he was calling time on? What was it about corporate social responsibility in that form that he said is just no longer tenable or reality?
There's a real difficulty with the notion that corporations can be ethical. And Browne was lauded because he announced that BP was going green. That was probably in the 80s. 40 years later, it's still as brown as ever. There is a real tension between corporations trying to be ethical and their reason for being, which is to maximise profit. And in the last 40 years, corporations have become incredibly powerful. I would argue the most powerful organisations in the world. And the reason they've done that is they've stopped paying tax and they've stopped paying proper wages. At the same time, because they want people to think they're a force for good and they don't want to be regulated properly, they've tried to reinvent themselves as ethical. And to do that, they've got involved in some social campaigns where they think they're going to be popular. And so it's an easier political activity to get involved when you've already got the wind behind your back. But when the going gets tough and it starts to affect profit, corporations will pull the pin. We saw that when Jeff Bezos from the Washington Post was about to endorse Kamala Harris. Clearly, its owner, who's a billionaire from Amazon, Jeff Bezos, decided that would be bad for business and canned the whole thing and said Washington Post isn't going to declare that either Kamala Harris or Trump should win the election. We're staying out of it. And that's really what happens. Corporations will get on board when it's easy and run for the hills when it gets tough. All political change which advances social justice is hard. Corporations ain't your friend, brands ain't your friend when the going gets tough.
What I'm picking up here is that corporate social responsibility, in your view, is very much a PR exercise and it's something that you see through. But if it accidentally benefits the community it's trying to engage with, is that such a bad thing?
No, it's not. There's undoubtedly attempts by people in corporations to do good things, philanthropy, donations, and so on and so forth. We shouldn't let that distract from the fundamental problems of the 21st century, which are that corporations are out of control. They have undermined the tax system. They've stopped paying wages properly. There's been a massive redistribution of power away from government to corporations. They're anti-democratic and they're also sabotaging our attempts to protect the environment. What I'm concerned about is young people, particularly, I'm sounding like an old fossil here, placing their faith in corporations to advance progressive political change. Once we do that, we reposition the corporation as at the heart of political activity when it isn't, and we forget how hard it is to struggle for positive political change, and that's got to be done by organising, by getting coalitions together and fighting politically. It's hard to make progressive political change and make a difference. Corporations are not our friend when it gets to the big, tough issues that are confronting the world at the moment.
In the lead up to this interview, I was, full transparency, racking my brain of sort of the things that we do here at work that sort of encourage, positive workspaces and the initiatives that we have in, the CSR space, the corporate social responsibility space. And when I think about internal activities, these are things that really build up our camaraderie and also, just lead to a better, positive workspace. Is that a bad thing?
No, they're not at all. I think when we go to work, we want to enrich our lives, and work is an incredibly important part of building community connections, exchanging views, creativity. We make friends, we make enemies, we collaborate, we fall out. It's a rich and should be enriching experience. I'm certainly not arguing against that, and if you're building solidarity, that's fantastic. Where I do draw a line is some of the traps people fall into in thinking that corporations are forces for progressive political change. There is no history book yet written, Chris, of corporations' record of achievement in achieving progressive social change. They didn't abolish slavery. They weren't there for the 8-hour week. They were against it. They have fought against sexual harassment laws and every other form of regulation that has been an important part of our political progression. And in the 21st century, corporations are now multinational monopolies that are out of control. And that's undermining our democracy. It's undermining government. And at work, what they do these days is try and silence any controversial expression by saying you're not allowed to do or say anything controversial that might bring us into disrepute. By doing that, they're requiring us to not say anything that attracts any controversy online. Controversy is at the heart of political exchange, political participation, and our citizenship. Unless we challenge the status quo, it can never change. Corporations want to suppress that to protect their brand.
Yeah, and I think I will push back, and not to be the poster child of corporations, and I love corporations, but I would say there have been times that I've observed where corporations set the tone on certain conversations that really need to happen. I'm thinking about the sporting codes and the conversations around racism. I'm thinking about, the pro-LGBTQIA plus conversations that brands have been leading the charge with in the 21st century.
Yeah. Surely
that's just not performative.
Yes, it is. In my view, it is performative, and I address this in the book, that as soon as Black Lives Matter erupted in the US, Nike and other corporations jumped online to profess their allegiance, but as soon as they did that, they were exposed for a range of misconduct, including mistreatment of diverse communities in their employment ranks. They're doing it in order to promote their brand, but they're also doing it in order to protect themselves from proper regulation. In the 21st century, corporations think of big tech. They are out of control. The harm that they're causing across the world is now being struggled against by governments all over the place. And so I think we have to be much more critical of their efforts at presenting what I consider an ethically washed brand.
And I want to bring it back a little bit to the worker. And, I'm sure there's a lot of listeners here that are thinking to themselves, okay, but how exactly does this impact me? I am curious to know, for a lot of people, working in big corporate environments, there may be things that the corporation is publishing or advertising or taking part of, initiatives that they are encouraging their staff members to join and, get behind, that may ideologically differ from their workers' personal views and opinions.
Yeah.
In those situations, what are the options available to, dissenting voices, employees who don't entirely agree with the corporate social responsibility or the position that their company is taking?
That's a very good question. Obviously, an employee in a corporation which is taking a political position should be able to not participate. Under our laws, if you have a political opinion or a religious affiliation, for example, you can't be sacked or victimised because of that. So if you had a different political perspective on a campaign or activity that the corporation was promoting, you should be able to not participate in that. Having said that, I can imagine there are situations where that's a source of great pressure and people feel that they have to do things that they're not so willing to do as part of trying to get ahead at work. But strictly speaking, if you do want to draw a line, you should be protected from any adverse consequences.
Employment lawyer Josh Bornstein there, and his book, Working for the Brand, How Corporations Are Destroying Free Speech, is out now. That's it for this episode of The Briefing. We'd love it if you could share it with someone who you think might enjoy it. If you want to keep up with our other content, you can. Just check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast, and on TikTok and YouTube, search Listener Newsroom. And we will be back in your feed with a fresh episode from 3. I'm Chris Spyrou. Catch you next time.
Listener.